Shadows, cast by Family Glory. If you asked anyone in our tight-knit Fargo community about the Walsh family, they'd likely picture Sunday barbecues on Maple Avenue and Brendan's easy grin at every school event. From the outside, we looked close, happy, maybe even enviable. But as the youngest, I, Colleen, always felt like a side note in the epic saga of my brother's rise. It was like the spotlight that lit up Brendan and all his small-town triumphs threw everything else, especially me, into shadow. Growing up, every family gathering became an audience for Brendan's next act. He wasn't just good at sports. He was the all-state athlete, earning trophies that lined our living room mantel. He wasn't just friendly. He had charisma that swayed teachers, neighbors, and relatives into his orbit. For my parents, each new success was validation. "That's our boy," Dad would say. The pride in his tone, unmistakable. Mom kept a scrapbook, thick with news clippings, awards, and his handwritten thank you notes from teachers. She'd bring it out for aunts and uncles, her face glowing with every turned page. Meanwhile, I learned to move quietly, on the edges. I became the behind-the-scenes helper, the one who took pictures at Brendan's games, helped serve cake at his parties, and then slipped away. I was the background hum to his headlining act, the one who fixed the Wi-Fi when it crashed, who set up new streaming devices, who made sure Mom's old laptop kept purring. None of this was glamorous. Sometimes my contributions were barely acknowledged. "Thanks, Colleen," Mom would say offhandedly, already moving to recount Brendan's latest big moment to the next relative walking through the door. I wanted to be noticed for something that was truly mine. I remember the night I won my first regional coding hackathon at 16. I came home, beaming, clutching my certificate. At dinner, before I could even start to share my news, Dad interrupted. "Brendan's got something to say." He was voted prom committee chair. Instantly, the conversation shifted. My win didn't even get a second glance. After dessert, I slipped the certificate into my desk drawer. It stayed there for years, unseen. I got used to measuring my worth in silent achievements. My dreams, building software that could actually make lives easier, launching projects my friends relied on, were my own private victories. Recognition from home seemed impossible. "That's nice, Colleen," Mom would say gently if I brought up my coding. But her eyes would inevitably scan for Brendan, ready to shower him with praise the second he mentioned a new interview or client lunch. It wasn't that they wished badly for me. Not really. I was simply typecast. The quiet tech girl, helpful but unremarkable, living in the shade of Brendan's blinding sun. Their expectations and subtle comparisons became so ingrained that I started to expect less for myself. I stopped bothering to share my hopes, figuring they'd always be drowned out by my brother's bigger stories. When I hit milestones, my first major freelance paycheck, getting accepted to an emerging tech incubator, I kept them to myself. I celebrated in silence, marking my growth in journals or with a quiet night out with friends. Still, I never hated Brendan for his charm or my parents for their focus on him. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the mantel lights glowed softly over his trophies, I'd feel a bittersweet pride at being part of a family others admired. But more and more, as I got older, those flickers of warmth couldn't disguise the ache of never really being seen. If my family's love was conditional, measured in how well I could fit into their narrative of success, I wondered if I would ever belong. And as my work and ambitions grew, my shadow life only deepened. By the time I founded Walsh Analytics, I was an expert at blending into the background. Dependable when needed, invisible the rest of the time. The family light was still Brendan's. I was left to navigate the world by the glow of my own quiet victories, waiting for anyone to finally look my way. The moment the truth was unveiled. That July evening in Fargo, the atmosphere inside Willow and Maine was thick with laughter and clinking cutlery. Classic Midwest luxury, wrapped in polished wood in warm, golden light. My brother Matthew floated from table to table, weaving his story for every eager ear. His charm was in full display, amplified tenfold with our extended family and his boss, Mr. Preston, sitting right at the center of it all. I kept to my corner, swirling ice in my glass, telling myself this was just another night I'd disappear behind his glow. But as dinner faded into speeches, my shoulders tightened. I could sense the let-up, the soft applause for Matt's new project win, warm words from my mother, my father's booming pride, every script, every smile, so predictable it almost made me laugh. I was rehearsing the act in my head. They'd toast Matt, I'd quietly slip out with Stacy before dessert, and nobody would remember I'd been there. Then the fork in the record scratched. It happened as Matt was launching into his now familiar pitch about spearheading the next big fintech rollout. He punctuated his own narrative with big hand gestures, making it sound like success had been inevitable. Because of him, my mother looked at him as if he hung the stars himself. I braced for the coming compliments, half amused, mostly numb. But just as the applause was swelling again, Mr. Preston stood up. The room grew silent fast. He had that kind of presence. He held one hand aloft, his graying hair picking up the shimmer of the pendant chandelier above. "Before we call it a night," he said, his voice carrying with the authority of experience, "I need to set the record straight." All eyes swiveled toward the podium. My brother's smile faltered just for a split second, maybe sensing the drift in the wind. Mr. Preston cleared his throat. "This entire fintech project was saved thanks to someone you all know, but maybe not well enough. Let's give our gratitude to Madison Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Analytics." The air split with applause, louder, longer than anything for Matt. Silverware clattered to a halt. All the familiar faces turned my way. For half a second, I thought I'd misheard. But then I saw him, Matt, frozen mid-celebration, half standing, his face open-mouthed with shock. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. My cheeks burned, but it wasn't embarrassment this time. I let the applause crash over me, a wave both exhilarating and surreal. My mother's eyes darted to the floor, my father's jaw clenched tight. It was as if their illusion had slipped. The flawless family success story, suddenly cracked by a public acknowledgement it couldn't disguise or redirect. Mr. Preston stepped closer to my table. "Madison, would you please say a few words?" Without looking at Matt, I stood, knees a little shaky, and breath catching somewhere between vindication and peace. The hush in the room pressed on my skin. This was what decades of dismissal had led to. A real, unvarnished moment under the spotlight I hadn't asked for, but certainly deserved. I made my way to the podium. The distance between my family and myself suddenly measured in light years, not just hardwood floors. "Thank you, Mr. Preston, and thank you, everyone," I managed, surprised at the steadiness of my voice. Building Carter Analytics wasn't about winning approval or applause. It was about solving real problems in the real world, with real people. My hands didn't tremble as I continued. "I'm grateful for everyone who believed in perseverance and hard work." I kept it brief. No mention of family, no rehearsed humility. Only gratitude to my team, to the partnership, and an acknowledgement of the work, not the politics, that had saved the project. The applause resonated again, but the loudest noise, for me, was the stunned silence radiating from my family side of the room. After, relatives and colleagues swirled around me with congratulations and heartfelt smiles. But Matt remained at his table, hunched, his hands clenching the edge of his plate. My mother had shrunk into herself, face closed and unreadable. My father wouldn't meet my gaze. For all the years I'd been transparent in their eyes, suddenly, I was the story that couldn't be rewritten. The truth, too loud and public to be ignored. When I left the restaurant later, it was quiet. The air in Fargo hummed with summer promise. My phone buzzed with messages I ignored. There was no gloating, no outburst, only a steady certainty blooming inside me. The kind that comes when, for the first time, your version of reality finally stands unchallenged. I drove home in silence, but felt lighter than I ever had under the family name. In that singular, unguarded moment, the truth, my truth, became undeniable, and the balance of power shifted quietly, forever. The forgotten years. If you asked me about my childhood in Austin, Texas, I'd struggle to recall many moments where I felt truly seen. The story always started and ended with my older brother, Ryan. He was the kind of person who drew the world's attention and never gave it back. School assemblies, family reunions, even the quiet nights around our kitchen table. If there was a spotlight to take, Ryan stood in it by default, leaving me to navigate life in the shadows he unthinkingly cast. I don't remember anyone ever purposely belittling me, but invisibility can cut deeper than actual insults. While my parents rejoiced at Ryan's every accomplishment, from elementary school science fairs to varsity football, to that day he landed his first flashy downtown job, I became the background character in their family narrative. My achievements faded quickly. When I got all A's for the first time, Mom's "Good job, Madison" was drowned out by her excitement that Ryan had just been appointed to some committee at his company, even though he'd only been there 6 weeks. It was almost comical how much of our home life revolved around him. The hallway corkboard was a shrine to Ryan. Photos of him in a Little League uniform, faded ribbons from old swim meets, handwritten Employee of the Month certificates. I'd pin up my own small wins, a science fair ribbon, an invitation from the robotics club, but they'd slide to the bottom, pushed aside by the next big Ryan update. I learned to stop asking for attention. It felt easier, less humiliating, to simply accept the background. In high school, I started building things, websites for friends' bands, little apps for teachers, the odd plug-in to help organize the school's chaotic locker schedule. I remember a particular weekend when I stayed up for 48 hours straight to deliver a program for Dad's business after his old spreadsheet finally gave out. He thanked me, of course, but his eyes sparkled that much brighter a week later when Ryan announced he'd closed his first client at his downtown gig. My work, useful as it was, didn't translate to pride in their language. And so I stopped volunteering information about what I was building. Even now, I wonder if they even understood what a hackathon was, or what it meant when I won regional coding competitions. My efforts belonged to me alone. College was a turning point, not because my family noticed me, but because it was the first time I allowed myself to see my own brilliance without waiting for someone else's validation. At the University of Texas, I blended into the stubborn, competitive crowd of computer science students. I loved the culture of late nights and collaborative tension, and finally, having conversations with people who cared about algorithms as much as football scores. It was there I first dreamed of starting my own company, of making a mark too clear to be ignored by anyone. It felt electric. My family, back in Austin, only ever heard that Madison was doing computer stuff. I rarely brought up my growing ambitions, Every call somehow turned into an update on Ryan's latest promotion, his sales bonuses, his new apartment in Houston. Years blurred together. Holidays back home became exercises in patience. Ryan would regale us with tales from his office, tossing out buzzwords he half understood, outlining his grand networking events with a swagger that made Dad beam. Meanwhile, I fixed my parents' Wi-Fi, helped install their smart TV, or quietly Venmo'd cash when Mom admitted she was short on a bill. They smiled, thanked me, uttered their lines. "You've always been so helpful, Maddie," then steered the dinner conversation back to Ryan's world. Sometimes I'd get texts weeks later. "Can you look at my laptop next time you're home?" Or, more often, "Your brother's doing so well. You must be proud." There was a part of me that stayed hopeful, mostly in the early years. I'd fantasize about the day something I built would transform their lives so completely they couldn't brush it aside. A banking app that Dad's company was forced to adopt, or a platform that ended up on national news. I craved that moment, chased it with a fervor that bordered on obsession. But no matter how much I did, it was never enough to disrupt the gravitational field around Ryan. When I landed my first job out of college, coding for a fintech startup, my parents told their friends I helped people with computers. When I called to let them know I'd made senior engineer, Mom couldn't wait to ask if I'd heard about Ryan's Christmas bonus. Work became my haven, in my battleground. Each ignored milestone fed the fire, pushing me to prove to myself I could matter, if not at home, then somewhere. I poured everything into my projects. Longer hours, more daring ideas, fiercer innovation. Slowly, the firestorm created change. Promotions, leadership roles, then, at last, the seed of something entirely my own, Carter Analytics. I worked out of spare bedrooms in corner coffee shops, living on takeout, caffeinated ambition, and the occasional late-night vent session with Emma, my best friend and unofficial therapist. The company grew. My world expanded. But at home, my role never changed. Thanksgiving dinners were the hardest. Extended family gathered around long, creaking tables, heavy with food, everyone piling praise on Ryan, even when his stories made no sense. I remember watching my aunts lean in for every word, cousins mimicking his laugh, my parents positively glowing. Once, he recounted a day at work where he nearly lost a client, but turned it all around with good old-fashioned charm. Everyone burst out laughing, but I knew from LinkedIn that same client had signed due to a last-minute technical fix. One my company, Carter Analytics, had stealthily provided as a subcontractor. Of course, I stayed silent. To correct them would ruin the harmony of their illusions. And besides, nobody would believe me. It was easier to let my success happen offstage, even when my fingerprints were all over Ryan's so-called triumphs. In some ways, those forgotten years shaped me more than any obvious hardship ever could. I learned how to listen, truly listen, to the needs that went unspoken around me. I became the silent support system for my family, the one who fielded late-night calls to solve technical emergencies, quietly transferred cash into their bank accounts to keep the lights on, or explained to Mom why her phone kept freezing. Every solution was met with a brief thanks. Sometimes, not even that. Just a relief sigh and a hasty return to whatever crisis Ryan presented next. I was the family ghost, present, essential, but never celebrated or even fully acknowledged. Sometimes, I'd wonder what life would have been like had I been an only child. Would Mom and Dad have seen me then? Or would they have simply found something else to attach their dreams to? Some imagined potential, some all-American story about overcoming odds that never really fit our reality. I'd brood over that when the loneliness got sharp during long drives home from work. But those thoughts faded when I saw the tangible impact of my work, the validation nobody in my family could grant. Clients emailed their thanks, my team grew and flourished, and banks sent glowing reviews for the products I built. Each success was one more step out of their shadow, even if they never realized it. Yet isolation has a way of etching itself into your routines. When Carter Analytics finally landed its first significant banking contract, I wanted to celebrate. I nearly called my parents, thumb hovering over my phone, before stopping myself. The news cycle in our family was closed. Only Ryan's updates broke through. So I took Emma to dinner instead. And together, we marked the milestone with laughter and cheap champagne on my tiny apartment floor. She toasted to the Queen of Quiet Revolutions. And for a moment, the ache of invisibility faded, replaced by the warmth of being seen by at least one person in my world. Those forgotten years taught me resilience, but they also taught me patience with myself and others. Every slight, every overlooked accomplishment toughened my skin. I learned to separate my sense of worth from my family's capacity to recognize it. I stopped asking them to celebrate my milestones. Instead, I set goals for myself. Bigger, harder, more daring. I set standards that nobody in my family would ever understand. But that made my own world richer, more exciting, more worth living. Looking back now, the ache of not being noticed doesn't sting the way it used to. I can still picture the walls of our Austin home, lined with Ryan's achievements, like museum exhibits, as if the past was an endless slideshow of only his triumphs. My photos, my certificates, my ribbons, they live in old drawers and quiet corners, faded, but not gone. In their own way, those relics remind me how far I've come despite being unseen. In the end, those years weren't wasted, even if they felt hollow at the time. They were the crucible from which I emerged, sharper and stronger. I stopped waiting for my family to witness my life. Instead, I built a life that would stand tall, even if only I knew its true weight. The forgotten years belonged to the version of me who wanted to be chosen first. The woman I am now knows her value isn't up for debate. If I ever cross paths with the old stories, I offer them a gentle smile and keep moving forward. The past made me, yes, but it no longer defines my borders. And that, finally, is a truth I get to decide for myself. All the unseen effort. If you asked anyone in my family about those years, they'd probably call them the good times. My parents would reminisce about Brendan's career milestones. My brother would recall the parties he hosted in his shiny new apartment. And to everyone else, the Walshes looked like a tight, happy Midwestern clan. But the reality, my reality, was a far cry from that Hallmark postcard. Looking back, it wasn't just the emotional distance that left its mark. The most bitter lines in my story were written in dollars and cents. For years, through college, and then well into my 20s, I became the financial safety net for my family. Each transfer, rent, gas, emergency groceries, overdue broadband, happened quietly, in the background of a life that wasn't supposed to be mine to support. There was never a conversation about it, never a plan. It simply became what I did, because I could, because they needed it, and because saying no felt like abandoning them, even as they left me feeling invisible. There was the time the power company threatened to shut off my parents' lights. I wired $500 before breakfast on a Monday, only to receive a quick reply from my mother. "Brendan's working really hard at his job, you know." I stared at her message, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted metal. Not a word about my help, not even a thank you, not even an acknowledgement that I was the one keeping the lights on while Brendan, who frequently forgot to pay his share, kept earning their applause. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was the pattern. My brother would text me, always casual, sometimes just a single line. Hey, Lisa's killing me this month. Can you spot me $1,000? I'd send him the money, often skipping small joys for myself, just to make room for yet another loan I knew would never be repaid. I always hoped, despite the evidence, that maybe this time he'd ask about me, about my work, about how I was coping, living alone in Minneapolis. But the follow-up was always the same. You're the best, sis, followed by radio silence until the next crisis. It wasn't just the money, really. It was the way they assumed, always, unspoken, that I'd handle their needs. When my mom's car broke down, I was the one who researched a good mechanic, transferred the repair costs, and fielded her frustration like an emotional sponge. When Dad needed help with taxes, or the front porch needed painting, or Brendan wanted to impress a date by showing off a new tech gadget, I was the one pulling the levers backstage. My own life, my achievements, my daily grind, all of that was invisible. It was as if my existence was measured only by how seamlessly I could keep their world running. What astonished me most was how none of this changed how they saw me. I became the family's fix-it person, the girl who knew computers and quietly paid the internet bill, not the CEO or founder or architect of my own future. My family's praise went where it always had, to Brendan. Even after I'd solved a particularly nasty malware problem on Dad's company laptop and restored files years in the making, he barely managed a, "Wow, thanks, Maddie," before pivoting to a story about Brendan's latest client dinner. The script never changed. I was always there in the wings, catching the falling scenery before it could spoil the show. But I was never invited to take a bow. For a while, I tried to convince myself they cared in their own way. Maybe Dad felt awkward expressing gratitude. Maybe Mom thought she was protecting me from family politics. Maybe Brendan really was just that self-absorbed. But it grew harder to make excuses when the money kept leaving my account and the silence kept echoing back. I started keeping a spreadsheet, a habit born of my analyst's brain. I logged every expense I'd covered, every bill I'd paid, every last Venmo request. The total after 5 years was staggering. Over $32,000 funneled from my startup salary and side hustles straight into the bottomless pit of family emergencies and Brendan's missed opportunities. Not once did they ask if I was okay, if the constant outflow was sustainable, or if I'd wanted to do something else with my life. Ironically, these invisible burdens fueled my ambition. Each ignored sacrifice became a reason to push harder at work, to build something that would finally put me in a place where I could define myself outside this cycle of unacknowledged support. But it also hardened something in me. Gratitude stopped being an expectation. Instead, I measured satisfaction in the steady, empowering rhythm of a growing company, in the respect of my colleagues. Two things my family never gave freely. It wasn't like I never got tired. There were nights I'd stare at invoices and bank statements, the glow of my laptop mingling with fatigue and resentment. Sometimes, I fantasized about what would happen if I just stopped. Would they even notice? Would Brendan figure out how to do his own taxes? Or would the whole facade crash? There were times I longed for family holidays to come without the dread of another urgent ask. Other times, I'd feel guilty for even resenting them because love meant sacrifice, right? That's what they'd always said. But deep down, I knew love meant more than invisible sacrifice. It was supposed to mean being seen, being valued, being part of something larger than utility or convenience. Instead, my efforts disappeared into the cracks of family legend, overshadowed by the next trophy or network event for Brendan. Looking back, I realized those years shaped me in ways I didn't understand while living them. They sharpened my problem-solving instincts, taught me the delicate mechanics of giving help without expectation, and made me deeply resilient. But they also taught me caution, boundaries, and eventually, when to say no. The unseen effort wasn't just a burden, it was the anvil on which my independence was forged. Still, it left scars that only honesty and distance could ever heal. Those years stand as a monument to all the ways a person can be irreplaceable and yet invisible, vital yet overlooked, and somewhere in the messy tension between sacrifice and self-worth, I figured out who I truly wanted to become. When silence becomes strength, that night hung in the air, electric and heavy, long after I left the restaurant. The city lights of Minneapolis wavered on the windshield as I drove home, carrying a strange sense of release inside me. I'd always envied people who could say the perfect comeback, deliver a sharp retort, and shatter the illusion with a sentence. But what no one tells you is that sometimes the absence of words, the calm, iron resolve to say nothing, can be more explosive than anything shouted aloud. I stood in my quiet kitchen, replaying the night on an endless loop, my family's stunned faces. Mom, with her eyes darting nervously between me and Brendan. Dad clutching his water glass as if hoping to drink in some courage. My brother, who for years had worn his role like armor, stripped of any pretense or easy charm under the weight of public truth. The memory wasn't triumph. It was a strange, brittle kind of peace. The days that followed crawled past, as if the universe was waiting to see if the balance would tip again. My phone grew heavy in my pocket, pinging with the first texts from Brendan. Then my parents. At first, I ignored them. An act so new, it sent a current through me. Their words alternated between uncomfortable apologies and desperate requests. Can you cover Brendan's rent just one more time? Could you call about getting his job back? I stared at the texts, my heart stuttering, and for the first time in years, I did nothing. For so long, my instinct had been to fix, to rush in with a transfer, a solution, a calm assurance that yes, everything would be handled, the bills would be paid, the messes quietly swept away before anyone could comment on the cracks in our family story. Each little rescue was a hope. Maybe this would be the time they'd see me, thank me, admit they'd relied on me all along. Instead, my role became the foundation they stood on, never questioning its strength until the day I refused to hold them up. Silence is uncomfortable. It leaves space for truths to grow wild, undirected. My parents didn't know what to do with my lack of response, and neither did Brendan. I realized with a kind of quiet awe that I didn't owe them an explanation or an argument. I'd said everything I needed the night of the party, not with a speech, but with proof. My presence, my work, the recognition from people who mattered. Now, by withholding both money and energy, I drove that truth home more forcefully than any confrontation could have. The first Saturday after the restaurant, Brendan tried calling 3 times in a row. I watched his name light up my phone and didn't answer. Later, an email landed in my inbox, more desperate than angry. Colleen, I know you're upset, but please, I really need you. Can you help? I typed out a reply, then deleted it. Letting him learn the shape of my absence was a lesson in itself, a language I had never dared to speak before. There was a raw power in those quiet days. It changed the air in my home, made coffee taste richer, sunlight warmer, my own footsteps echo with a steadier confidence. I went for walks in the city, music in my ears, listening to songs that had always made me feel invisible. Now they underscored a strength I hadn't acknowledged before. The absence of family chaos let me see the shape of my own needs. Rest, creation, laughter, even loneliness in its simplest, least defensive form. One evening, Stacy stopped by with Thai food, her hair still up from work, eyes bright with pride. She asked how I was holding up, truly meaning it. And when I shrugged and admitted I was struggling with guilt, she didn't rush to smooth things over. She just listened, refusing to rewrite the story to make anyone else the victim. "You know, Colleen," she said, pushing her noodles around, "the only way they'll understand is if you stop making it easy for them. You stepping back isn't cruelty, it's honesty." That stuck with me. Honesty, not punishment. I learned that in silence, I could finally hear myself. I stopped picking up every midnight call, stopped editing my emails for comfort, and let the unanswered messages serve as both boundary and invitation. If my family wanted to really know me, to repair what had broken, they'd have to start with respect, not requests. In the weeks after, life at Walsh Analytics blossomed. I poured my energy into the company, mentoring junior analysts and leading morning stand-ups with unexpected humor. Evenings, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, drafting visions for the future of the firm and for my own life, too. The idea of family became less about blood and more about reciprocity, support, and the trust that if you fall apart, someone will notice, will care enough to ask. And not only when they're desperate for help. Unexpectedly, my parents and Brendan pulled away, their silence matching mine, but carrying a different weight. I let it happen. There were moments of ache, memories of childhood road trips, holiday mornings, birthdays, where I'd once tried so hard for a crumb of approval. But instead of chasing after those memories, I let them settle. They were a chapter, vivid and real, but not the whole story. When silence became strength, I stopped needing proof of my worth. I didn't need to outshine Brendan or show up at every gathering with my resume ready. My life unfolded on my terms, and my work spoke for itself. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final screaming match, just the quiet, sometimes painful, sometimes gentle, of letting go, and in that space, discovering all the things I could nurture for myself. What I learned in those silent weeks is this: you are not required to light yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Love is not a ledger. The family you're born into can shape you, but you choose how much space they take up in your future.
Confirmed.
For me, letting silence settle was not defeat. It was the beginning of a different strength and the true starting line for everything I would become. The turning of power. It didn't happen overnight, but the seismic shift in my family's dynamic could no longer be denied after the night my truth came to light. I'd always thought that real power belonged to those who claimed it loudest, the ones setting the agenda, making the speeches, collecting applause. But life, in its quietly subversive way, showed me that true authority is often born from the act of finally saying, enough. A few weeks after that eventful dinner, the air around my family felt brittle and uneasy. My parents' texts, once reliably cheerful and full of thinly veiled direction. "Did you call your brother? Don't forget Brendan's birthday. Can you help out with the insurance paperwork?" grew stilted. Brendan himself shrank from his exuberant check-ins and late-night Venmo requests to a tense, watchful distance. I noticed the quiet, but this time I let it settle, refusing to rush in. and restore the old order, simply to keep things comfortable. That's when the real test of new boundaries arrived. My brother was let go from his job, ironically, a direct result of procedural changes that stemmed from improvements my own company had helped roll out. It wasn't personal, but Brendan took it that way. My parents did too. They saw it as a family betrayal. Within days, they were at my front door in Minneapolis, rain clinging to their coats, urgent and pleading. I opened the door to find my mother's eyes red-rimmed, my father pacing with barely contained desperation, and Brendan trailing behind them, posture collapsed like a child who's lost his way. "Colleen, you have to help him," Mom insisted. "Can't you just call someone? They need to rehire him. You know people there now, right? Just pull some strings." I felt 100 old instincts snap to attention. The fixer in me, the girl who had absorbed their chaos, who'd quietly kept plates spinning for years, nearly answered the call, but I stayed rooted, arms crossed gently. "You're asking me to undo policies I helped put in place. Changes made for a reason," I replied, voice soft but resolute. "Brendan needs to learn to stand on his own. It's time." The silence that followed was thunderous. My father's jaw clenched. Brendan avoided my eyes. My mother's voice cracked. "But family is supposed to help. Family doesn't give up." I breathed in, steadying myself, feeling Emma's supportive presence in my mind, her voice echoing the simple truth: boundaries are not abandonment. "I love you all," I said, "but I'm not responsible for managing everyone else's choices. I can't keep stepping in and pretending that nothing ever needs to change." Almost immediately, I felt the weight of unspoken history. The years of being unacknowledged, unappreciated, simply taken for granted, settle on my shoulders, no longer a burden, but a mantle of clarity. Brendan finally looked up, bitterness sharp in his eyes. "So what? Now that you've got what you wanted, you're better than us." My heart twinged, but I didn't flinch. "No, Brendan, I'm not better. I'm just not willing to live by a script that erases me. You have to face things yourself. We all do." The conversation ended with my parents leaving, defeated and bewildered. Brendan sulking in the front seat, quiet in a way I'd never witnessed. As I closed the door behind them, the relief was almost physical. An ache I'd grown so used to carrying, finally easing from my bones. For the first time, I understood that saying no wasn't an absence of love, but an act of fierce self-respect. The center of gravity in my family had shifted, and this time, it wasn't coming back to its old place. Over the following weeks, I watched from a deliberate distance as my family tried to find their bearings. Brendan floundered, cycling through blame and resentment, before gradually, painfully, beginning to take small steps on his own. My parents withdrew, pride wounded, their messages chilly, but no longer riddled with demands. Emma, ever the friend who believed most fiercely in my strength, reminded me that not all healing feels gentle at first. Sometimes, the truest kindness is letting others face reality without a safety net you can no longer afford to provide. The more I held my ground, the more power I found in the space I'd cleared for myself. At Carter Analytics, I poured myself into projects, finding satisfaction not just in the work, but in belonging to a world where my merit was a matter of record, not rumor. My team's respect was genuine. Feedback, even when direct, never felt like an attack on my worth. I led with a newfound calm, allowing my story to be a tool for others, mentoring junior engineers whose backgrounds echoed mine, teaching them that sometimes you have to walk away from old patterns if you want to step into your own light. My family was forced to form new habits. They called less, asked for little, slowly learning to look after themselves, even if it meant awkward phone calls to service providers or nervous job interviews. I missed parts of the old routine, the rush of being needed, the comfort of fitting into an established role. But missing it was different from wanting it back. There would be no return to that lopsided bargain. Eventually, Brendan reached out, not for help, but to acknowledge what he had never seen before. I didn't realize how much you did for us. I'm not there yet, but thanks, I guess. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but I didn't need one. Real change rarely comes in sweeping gestures. It happens quietly, in awkward conversations, in unreturned calls. As autumn settled over Minneapolis, suffusing the city with a kind of golden nostalgia, I knew that power had changed hands in my family, not because I demanded it, but because I finally claimed it for myself. I learned that the moment you reclaim your narrative, you give everyone else the opportunity to grow, too. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, to craft our lives with intention, even as we remember where we came from. The turning of power was never about control. It was about freedom, mine, and someday, perhaps even theirs. Rebirth, after the spotlight. Those first weeks after everything unraveled felt eerily quiet. There was a fragile stillness in my daily life, like fresh fallen snow that muffles every sound. I found myself wandering my Minneapolis apartment in the mornings, coffee in hand, waiting for a call, a knock, or even some new crisis from home. Except now, there was only an unfamiliar peace. Months earlier, I would have mistaken this calm for loneliness. Now, it felt like a threshold, one I'd never been allowed to cross until I finally set down the burdens I'd been carrying for so long. Work at Carter Analytics was busier than ever. Growth meetings, product launches, negotiations that demanded my full attention. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. For years, every success, every meeting, every late-night brainstorming session was shadowed by a hope that someone back home would notice, that maybe a cousin would mention my name, that my mother would finally tell her friends about the company I'd built, the jobs I'd created, the community I'd quietly served. But after my family's departure, after I watched them walk back into the Minnesota rain, without the old patterns, without their expectations dragging behind them, I let that craving for validation fall away. One Friday, I booked a ticket to San Francisco on a whim. My first spontaneous trip in years. I needed perspective. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched before me that misty morning, sunlight glinting through the fog, and for the first time, I allowed myself to savor the freedom that came with not being anyone's safety net, but my own. I stood with the wind whipping my hair, the city rumbling behind me, and remembered the girl who had always wanted to be indispensable. I thought of all the ways I had twisted myself to fit the Walsh family myth, the fixer, the silent partner, the one behind the curtain. Here, with the cold air burning my cheeks and nobody needing me for anything, I felt taller, lighter, quietly jubilant. My value could exist entirely outside the gaze of anyone who failed to truly see me. I lingered along the bay, nursing a cup of strong black coffee, letting the city's noise replace old echoes of family drama. I people-watched, lost in the parade of unfamiliar faces, half expecting some hidden grief to catch me by surprise. But the pain didn't come. I realized gradually that the ache of being overlooked at home had given way to a new kind of longing, not for their approval, but for new adventures on my own terms. That longing fueled me. I mapped out ideas for Carter Analytics on napkins, filled a journal with sketches for a future that wasn't built as compensation for someone else's respect, but simply because I wanted to see what I could create for myself. No one was keeping score anymore but me. Back in Minneapolis, I let myself adopt unfamiliar habits. I started Saturday mornings at a small yoga studio downtown, joined a group for women founders, and let Stacy drag me to open mic nights, where I laughed until my sides hurt and remembered what honest fun felt like. Sometimes, guilt would bubble up, especially when news from Austin trickled in. Ryan, I heard, was floundering in a job search. My parents struggled with mounting bills, but I found compassion for them no longer required self-sacrifice. I sent thoughtful texts. I answered the rare call without bracing for another ask. Eventually, the conversations grew less frequent. Awkward at first, then peacefully sparse. We were all learning new roles, even if the space between us endured. My old desire to prove my worth gave way to a tender acceptance. My story would never loom as large in my childhood home as my brothers had. That was their limitation, not mine. I spent my evenings filling my apartment with music, cooking ambitious new recipes, and letting the gentle hum of the city become a lullaby. For the first time, I routinely blocked off weekends that were sacred. No work, no family duties, just time to breathe and remember who I was before anyone else's needs eclipsed my own. One autumn afternoon, walking around the lakes near my place, I stopped to watch the sunlight ignite the yellow maples and crimson oaks. In that sudden blaze of color, I finally articulated what had changed. There was no going back. Not to the girl waiting for applause. Not to the daughter or sister trying to buy or fix her way to acceptance. I had withstood the storm and chosen myself, quietly, unequivocally. There were scars, of course, deep grooves carved by years of invisibility and unreciprocated love. But I wore them now as evidence of survival, not shame. New opportunities kept blossoming. Carter Analytics landed a partnership with a nonprofit serving Midwestern rural banks. The kind of project my parents might one day hear about through community gossip, rather than from me. I laughed when the board of directors invited me to deliver a keynote at a major conference. I wore a power suit, stood on stage bathed in spotlights of my own choosing, and talked about the grit required to build something lasting when no one expects greatness from you. The applause, this time, was real and unburdened. I made time to mentor young women in tech, girls who reminded me of my 16-year-old self, hungry for visibility and fearful of taking up too much space. I told them what I wished I'd heard, that your work means something, even if the world refuses to notice at first. Keep going. Define yourself before anyone else gets the chance. I still felt pangs for the family I once longed to impress, but that ache became quieter each season. Every boundary I enforced, every moment I let myself rest or play, became a reclamation, a small ritual washing away the residue of old obligations. Over time, even the silence between my parents and me, between me and Ryan, felt less like punishment and more like space I'd made for growth. For all of us, if there's any wisdom in rebirth after the spotlight fades, it's this. The narrative you inherit only defines you until you decide to rewrite it. I never stopped loving my family. I simply learned that sometimes love demands distance and the courage to define your own worth. The page has turned, and this time the pen is in my hand, and the story I'm writing is finally, unmistakably, my own.